Welcome to a new episode of Cheaters Always Cheat. Like, subscribe, and share to stay connected.
I've come here to Reddit to reveal a shameful secret and seek guidance on something that has been bothering me for far too long. My name is Sarah, and I'm a 32-year-old woman residing in a beautiful house in the suburbs of Chicago. I am married to a wonderful man named Jack. Jack is the type of person who can enter a room and instantly command respect, not by issuing commands or boasting about his achievements, but simply through his presence, integrity, and hard-earned success. Jack owns a thriving IT company and treats me exceptionally well. Even after 3 years of marriage, the spark between us remains strong. His eyes still light up when he sees me, and our nights are filled with love and passion. He is not only financially secure but also emotionally mature, considerate, and treats me with respect and kindness. Despite all of this, I made a grave mistake. Before Jack, I was married to Mike, who was like a wild storm, unpredictable and incredibly exciting but ultimately destructive. Mike was never successful in the conventional sense. He held various odd jobs, spent his nights in pool halls and bars, and sometimes got into fights. He had a charming, mischievous smile that could win over even the sternest hearts. Mike, then and now, is a motorcyclist. His bad boy persona wasn't just an act. He was the guy in leather, riding a Harley, getting into bar fights, a person who lived life on the edge, always flirting with disaster but somehow managing to bounce back. You might be wondering how I ever fell for someone like Mike. Part of it was the thrill of unpredictability, the exhilarating feeling of living without rules. But the truth is, I was young and easily impressed by his apparent rebelliousness. Our marriage, as you can imagine, was a wild ride with extreme highs and devastating lows. It ended predictably, with a series of arguments, tears, and plenty of regret. When I met Jack, it felt like waking up from a long and tumultuous dream. Here was a man who was everything Mike wasn't: stable, successful, mature, and respectful. He was the calm after the storm. I fell for him instantly, and I believed I had finally found my happily ever after. But it seems the past has a knack for resurfacing at the most unexpected times. It was at a charity event, something Jack and I frequently attended, that I unexpectedly crossed paths with Mike. There he stood in his weathered leather jacket amidst a crowd dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, looking entirely out of place yet unapologetically himself. His mischievous grin hadn't faded; if anything, it had grown even more captivating over time. As we had a couple of drinks, old memories resurfaced, and the excitement I had once felt rushed back to me. I let myself get carried away in the moment, drawn in by his daring charm. And that's when it happened. We ended up at his shabby apartment, a place filled with the scent of motor oil and whiskey. I cheated on Jack. From that point on, I was overwhelmed with guilt and remorse. What was I thinking? Why did I allow myself to be swayed by the illusion of a past that brought more pain than pleasure? Mike, with his chaotic lifestyle, stood in stark contrast to the calm, reassuring stability that Jack provided me. Jack is everything I desire in a life partner. Since that night, I've been haunted by my actions. The weight of my betrayal crushes me daily. Jack, who is unaware of my infidelity, continues to be the loving and supportive husband he has always been. Meanwhile, I am racked with guilt, knowing that I jeopardized the best thing that ever happened to me for a fleeting moment of excitement. Now, I am at a crossroads. Do I confess my indiscretion to Jack and risk destroying our marriage, or do I carry this burden alone, hoping that the guilt will eventually subside? I am tormented by my choices and the possible consequences. Jack deserves the truth, but I fear that revealing it will cause irreparable damage. In seeking advice, I hope to find some clarity. How do I navigate this situation without losing the man who has brought so much stability and joy into my life? Is it possible to atone for my mistake and rebuild the trust that I shattered? These questions plague me as I struggle to find a path forward. The fear of losing Jack and the life we've built together haunts me. I desperately seek guidance to help me make the right decision. In a life partner, he's everything one could wish for: supportive, kind, strong, and successful. Most importantly, he loves and respects me. Yet, the memory of that night with Mike has been tormenting me, gnawing at my conscience and filling my heart with dread. The worst part? I believe Jack suspects something. Jack has been unusually quiet since I came home late that night, claiming to have lost track of time while shopping. His silence is overwhelming, and it terrifies me. Jack isn't the type to confront someone without evidence, but I can sense that something has shifted between us. I'm in a tough spot. Should I come clean with Jack, risking our years of trust, or should I keep this awful secret, hoping he remains unaware, and live with this guilt forever? I know I messed up, and I deeply regret it, but I'm terrified. I could really use your guidance. What's the right course of action, Reddit? What would you do if you were in my situation? Now for my first update. It's Sarah again, with some developments to share. Things have taken a darker turn. Jack's suspicions are growing, and he has started probing into the night I claim to have been shopping. His questions are logical and reasonable, the kind anyone would ask if they doubted their partner's faithfulness. But to me, they feel like sharp arrows, each one digging deeper into my guilt-ridden heart. He requested the shopping receipts, which caught me off guard, and I hastily came up with the first excuse that popped into my head. I told him I had paid in cash and tossed the receipts. It was a flimsy explanation, and his skeptical look made it clear he didn't buy it. I felt like I was walking on thin ice and was well aware of it. Then he inquired about any other evidence of my whereabouts that night, sending my heart racing. It was as if he were following the breadcrumbs of my lie, inching closer to the painful truth. I muttered something about not having my phone with me while shopping, adding another falsehood to my crumbling facade. Then he hit me with a bombshell. He asked for my Google login to check my map history. My heart sank as I recalled using Google Maps that ill-fated night to find Mike's dingy apartment. In a moment of panic, I chose to act defensive, questioning his trust and intentions, and it led to a minor argument. It wasn't a proud moment for me, but fear and guilt had me tightly in their grip, and I felt trapped. He was persistent, not aggressive, but resolute in his request. Eventually, I relented but deliberately provided him with the wrong password, hoping to buy some time. Since then, I've been avoiding Jack, immersing myself in work and errands, anything to keep me away from the house and another confrontation. But I can't hide forever. Sooner or later, he'll ask for the correct password, and then I'll run out of excuses. I'm living in fear, Reddit. I've created a complete mess. Now I find myself in a situation where the truth could utterly shatter my world. I'm terrified of losing Jack, of losing the life I've always dreamed of, the life we've built together. I'm petrified that my terrible mistake might completely disrupt my life. The guilt is consuming me, and the fear of getting caught is paralyzing. I still need your assistance, Reddit. I value your advice and perspectives. What's the right course of action here? Should I confess before he discovers the truth himself, or should I remain silent and hope for the best? Is there even a correct way to navigate this situation? This is Sarah, back one last time with a heavy heart and a story that hasn't ended well. The inevitable happened sooner than I anticipated. Jack uncovered everything, not through a confrontation or my confession, but through the unfeeling tracking of Google Maps. He saw my location on that fateful night, those 3 hours at Mike's apartment. He knew. I realized the truth the morning I got up early to make Jack breakfast before his usual commute, but he had already left. All that remained was a note on the kitchen counter, a painful and poignant explanation that he knew everything, that he had seen it all. His attorney and the divorce papers were on their way. As I read the note, it felt like my heart was being squeezed in a vice. I could barely breathe, and the room seemed to spin around me. The letter slipped from my trembling hands, falling to the floor, mirroring the collapse of my world. I collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down my face, as the harsh reality of my actions hit me like a powerful force. I tried everything, Reddit. I called him, sent text messages, and wrote letters, all in a desperate attempt to explain, apologize, and beg for his forgiveness. But it was all futile. Jack remained unresponsive, as immovable as a statue. He didn't react to any of my efforts to reach out. He had always been a man of few words, and now his silence spoke volumes. Every moment of it served as a painful reminder of the trust one had shattered. The cold, emotionless demeanor he had adopted towards me was a stark contrast to the warmth and love he had once shown. Now, I'm in search of a place to rent. The alimony I receive isn't much, although Jack was more than fair. It will only cover a modest apartment, a far cry from the beautiful home we had created together. I already miss it deeply, the aroma of fresh coffee in the mornings, the sound of Jack playing the piano, the quiet conversations we shared at the dinner table, and the dream of starting a family soon. This loss brings tears to my heart. The vision of raising a child in our lovely home, sharing our love with our little one, has been shattered. I've taken that dream away from him, from us. I bear the responsibility for not only ruining our present but also our future. I conclude this post with a heavy heart, burdened by the painful realization that I've committed the gravest error of my life. I've learned through harsh experience that choices carry consequences, some of which are irreversible. I've lost Jack, the man who loved me despite my imperfections and wanted to build a future together. Now, all that remains are the remnants of a marriage I've dismantled and a guilt that will forever weigh on my conscience. Jack, I am deeply sorry for the pain I've inflicted upon you. I wish I could undo my actions, but all I can do now is accept the repercussions and strive to grow from my mistakes. I hope that someday you can find it within yourself to forgive me, even if we can never return to what we once had. I also want to express my gratitude to everyone who read my story and offered advice. Thank you. My hope is that you can learn from my mistakes and cherish those who truly love you, guarding against moments of weakness that could jeopardize the most precious aspects of your life. Alright, that was a heartfelt story, but now let's move on to another intriguing one. I am in a unique situation and am wondering if anyone else has experienced something similar. It's not me who is suffering here, it's my husband, kids, and parents dealing with the consequences of my past mistakes, and I am truly sorry for that. To be straightforward, approximately 19 months ago, I was discovered having an affair with a married neighbor who has 3 children. I am a 32-year-old woman, my husband is 39, and the neighbor, whom I'll call Steve for privacy, was 27 at that time. I made a huge mistake by beginning this affair, which started a little over 2 years ago. Even though the affair lasted nearly 5 months before we were caught, I was physically with Steve only 4 times in total. I understand it's difficult to believe, but I promise it's true. Now, let me address the questions about my marriage that I know many of you have. Were we having issues? Did I not love my husband? Was I unhappy? The answer to all these questions is a definite no. I was extremely happy and content in my marriage, and I love my husband and our 2 boys, aged 9 and 11, more than anything else in the world. Jim, my husband, fulfilled me emotionally, mentally, and physically. He was everything I ever dreamed of and more. My attraction to Steve, which was misdirected, came from a deep part of me that reminded me of my first romantic experience when I was 18. It was a wild attraction, much like that first time. During high school, I casually dated 4 boys, but nothing serious, just a quick kiss at the end of a date. In fact, I saw all of them as friends since we all grew up together. Then one day, I got invited to a barbecue at my friend's parents' house. That's where I met Charles, who was my friend's cousin. The first time I saw him, I was captivated. At that time, he was 20, and I was 18. From the moment we met, we couldn't stop looking at each other. I can't explain it, but there was an undeniable attraction that drew me to him like a magnet to metal. We began talking at the barbecue, but he had to leave for work, so we exchanged phone numbers. The next day, which was a Sunday, we met for ice cream in the evening and took a walk. We conversed for hours, fully engrossed in each other, and then we spontaneously began kissing. He invited me back to his apartment, and there I had my first intimate encounter. It was like magic, even better than I had ever envisioned. Something about Charles thrilled me in a way that made me want to give him every part of myself. Even now, I struggle to articulate it. It was something deep within, a subconscious urge that I couldn't resist. Other than the physical attraction, we had nothing in common. Honestly, we were not compatible. I ended things with Charles 11 months later when the initial excitement faded. A year after that, I met my current husband, Jim. Although the initial spark wasn't as intense as it was with Charles, over time, I developed a profound love for Jim that surpassed anything I had previously experienced. Jim met all my criteria, and I knew he was the one for me. We got married a year later, and our marriage brought us 13 years of happiness, until I ruined it. We were blessed with 2 amazing boys who are the spitting image of their dad and share his delightful personality. I'm sharing these details because they are relevant to why I started the affair with Steve. Steve and his wife, let's call her Marcia, moved into our neighborhood. They were the youngest couple in the community and received a warm welcome from everyone. Interestingly, my husband and I were the second youngest couple, with the rest of our neighbors being in their 40s, 50s, and some even in their 60s. Steve and Marcia attended a neighborhood picnic, and it was there that he and I first exchanged glances. Steve ensured we got a good deal from the salesman and secured excellent financing for us during the closing process. Steve and I kept exchanging glances, although my husband didn't notice. A few days later, I had to return to the dealership to have mud flaps installed, and it was during that visit that Steve and I had our first inappropriate encounter. When he saw me in the lounge, he came over to greet me. He then invited me to his office because he had some extra financing details to discuss. We sat down, had some coffee, and started talking, much like I did with Charles. Out of nowhere, he admitted that he wanted a private discussion with me about his feelings. He mentioned feeling a strong connection and noticed that I was looking at him intently. I confessed feeling something too, but knew it was wrong. He acknowledged that it was wrong but didn't care and expressed his desire for me. Fast forward to the next morning, we had our first intimate encounter at his house after our children went to school and our spouses left for work. By the way, my husband Jim has a good job, and Marcia is a licensed practical nurse, LPN. As I mentioned, Steve and I only had physical relations 4 times during the entire 5-month period. There was absolutely no emotional connection between us because I loved Jim, and Steve loved Marcia. What we had was purely physical, and I have to be honest, it didn't compare to what I had with my husband, not even close. However, it was forbidden, which made it thrilling and risky. Reflecting now, I think being a stay-at-home mom, Sam, for 11 years made me crave the attention I was receiving from this younger, attractive man. I thought I could have this secret adventure for a while and still maintain a loving and fulfilling marriage with my husband. All those thoughts came crashing down one Thursday morning 19 months ago. That's when Steve and I were caught in bed at his house by Marcia's mother. She walked in on us while we were fully involved and immediately started shouting angrily. She slapped and scratched Steve across the face, leaving a deep gash with her nails. She also struck me on the jaw and yanked out chunks of my hair before I could grab my clothes and leave the house. When I got back to my own home, I was in complete shock over what had just happened, and the reality of my actions hit me hard. I realized that my perfect marriage with Jim was forever changed and could potentially end. Due to this, I sat quietly for several hours, simply staring at the walls, thinking about how I would break the news to my husband. Eventually, I decided to call him and left an urgent message. I mentioned that there was something very important I needed to discuss with him. He didn't respond, so I sent him a text, but still got no reply. At that moment, I suspected that Marcia or perhaps even Steve had already contacted him. A few minutes later, Marcia and her mother arrived at our front porch, banging on the door and the bay window, shouting for me to answer. I didn't respond. They were yelling offensive words and insisting that they knew I was inside, urging me to unlock the door. I felt intense fear and profound embarrassment. Thankfully, my kids were at school during all of this. Eventually, they left, and I lay down on the couch, shedding tears. I briefly drifted off to sleep and woke up when I heard a car door close in the driveway. I hurried to the bathroom to splash water on my face and check my appearance in the mirror before returning to the living room to greet him when he arrived. However, he didn't come inside. Instead, I saw through the window that he was walking down the street towards Steve and Marcia's house. I watched him as he headed there and stayed for almost 3 hours before coming back home. When he returned, I tried to hug him, but he kept his distance. I started to apologize, but he told me that he couldn't accept my apology and insisted that I leave immediately. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing and pleading, telling him I didn't want to go, but he remained firm. He then called my mother and informed her about my actions, asking her to come over and pick me up. My mom arrived, offered her apologies to Steve, and persuaded me to go back to her house for the night. She helped me gather some clothes, and I left while tearfully asking Jim how he would explain this to the kids. He assured me he would handle it, and I left feeling heartbroken and ashamed. That night, I called Jim, and to my surprise, he answered. When he did, he simply greeted me and then fell silent. I identified myself and expressed my deep regret and promised that I would never repeat such a mistake. I also vowed to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to him. Jim didn't respond and only asked if I had anything else to say. I replied with a no and inquired about his feelings. He responded with, "You know how I feel," and I began to cry. He then suggested that I stay at my parents' house for a couple of weeks before coming back home. I agreed reluctantly but asked when I could see him and the boys again. He replied that he didn't want to see me right now but agreed to have a short phone call with me every evening at 9 p.m. Our first call ended with me saying, "I love you," and Jim simply hanging up without a response. The next night's call went the same way, with me apologizing and Jim remaining silent until I finished talking. Then he dropped a bombshell: he wanted a divorce. Hearing this devastated me, and I begged him for another chance. He refused and mentioned that he knew he would have to split his hard-earned assets in a divorce. However, in the next breath, he said he'd give me everything he owned if I would just disappear and leave him and the boys alone. I couldn't believe it and told him he didn't mean it, but he insisted that he did. We ended the call, and I cried throughout the night. I began thinking of ways to make him stay and came up with a plan to offer him a post-nuptial agreement that would heavily favor him, hoping he wouldn't refuse it. All I wanted was a second chance to prove my love to him, no matter the cost. During the following week, while Jim was consulting his divorce attorney, I was meeting with a divorce attorney myself, not to prepare for divorce but to create a postnuptial agreement to present to Jim before receiving divorce papers. I visited 4 different attorneys before finding one who specialized in postnuptial agreements and was willing to craft such a one-sided agreement. It's a one-sided agreement because my husband would receive most of the benefits in exchange for staying married to me for a specific period, giving me a chance to rebuild our love. Due to this, I sat quietly for hours, just staring at the walls, thinking about how I would break the news to my husband. Eventually, I decided to call him and left an urgent message. I mentioned that there was something very important I needed to discuss with him. He didn't respond, so I sent him a text, but still got no reply. At that moment, I suspected that Marcia or perhaps even Steve had already contacted him. A few minutes later, Marcia and her mother arrived at our front porch, banging on the door and the bay window, screaming for me to answer. I didn't respond. They were shouting offensive words and insisting they knew I was inside, urging me to unlock the door. I felt intense fear and profound embarrassment. Thankfully, my kids were at school during all of this. Eventually, they left, and I lay down on the couch, shedding tears. I briefly dozed off and woke up when I heard a car door close in the driveway. I hurried to the bathroom to splash water on my face and check my appearance in the mirror before returning to the living room to greet him when he arrived. However, he didn't come inside. Instead, I saw through the window that he was walking down the street towards Steve and Marcia's house. I watched him as he headed there and stayed for almost 3 hours before coming back home. When he returned, I tried to hug him, but he kept his distance. I started to apologize, but he told me that he couldn't accept my apology and insisted that I leave immediately. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing and pleading, telling him I didn't want to go, but he remained firm. He then called my mother and informed her about my actions, asking her to come over and pick me up. My mom arrived, offered her apologies to Steve, and persuaded me to go back to her house for the night. She helped me gather some clothes, and I left while tearfully asking Jim how he would explain this to the kids. He assured me he would handle it, and I left feeling heartbroken and ashamed. That night, I called Jim, and to my surprise, he answered. When he did, he simply greeted me and then fell silent. I identified myself and expressed my deep regret, promising that I would never repeat such a mistake. I also vowed to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to him. Jim didn't respond and only asked if I had anything else to say. I replied with a no and inquired about his feelings. He responded with, "You know how I feel," and I began to cry. He then suggested that I stay at my parents' house for a couple of weeks before coming back home. I agreed reluctantly but asked when I could see him and the boys again. He replied that he didn't want to see me right now but agreed to have a short phone call with me every evening at 9 p.m. Our first call ended with me saying, "I love you," and Jim simply hanging up without a response. The next night's call went the same way, with me apologizing and Jim remaining silent until I finished talking. Then he dropped a bombshell: he wanted a divorce. Hearing this devastated me, and I begged him for another chance. He refused and mentioned that he knew he would have to split his hard-earned assets in a divorce. However, in the next breath, he said he'd give me everything he owned if I would just disappear and leave him and the boys alone. I couldn't believe it and told him he didn't mean it, but he insisted that he did. We ended the call, and I cried throughout the night. I began thinking of ways to make him stay and came up with a plan to offer him a postnuptial agreement that would heavily favor him, hoping he wouldn't refuse it. All I wanted was a second chance to prove my love to him, no matter the cost. During the following week, while Jim was consulting his divorce attorney, I was meeting with a divorce attorney myself, not to prepare for divorce but to create a postnuptial agreement to present to Jim before receiving divorce papers. I visited 4 different attorneys before finding one who specialized in postnuptial agreements and was willing to craft such a one-sided agreement. It's a one-sided agreement because my husband would receive most of the benefits in exchange for staying married to me for a specific period, giving me a chance to rebuild our love. Jim's lawyer prepared the divorce papers in just 11 days, and I was served with them at my parents' house 2 days later. I had Jim served with the proposed postnuptial agreement. That night, after he read the proposal, we had a conversation. He seemed somewhat surprised by what I had offered, and for the first time in the past 2 weeks, I sensed the caring person I once knew resurfacing rather than the angry and emotionally distant man he had been. Financially and personally, this agreement is a clear win for Jim and an opportunity for me to demonstrate my value to him. I won't go into specific details about the postnuptial agreement, but I can confirm that it allows Jim to retain most of our marital assets if we remain married and living together for at least 30 months. Furthermore, if I were ever unfaithful again and we got a divorce, I would forfeit any claim on our marital assets, meaning I'd get nothing and waive any entitlement to alimony or child support. The agreement also requires me to secure a full-time job within the next 6 months and start contributing to our household expenses. Lastly, it allows my husband the option to see other women if he wishes to during the remainder of our marriage. I know Jim would never cheat, it's just not in his nature, but I want him to know that I love him enough to give him this choice. To my surprise and happiness, Jim agreed to the offer but with one extra condition. He wanted a clause stating that there is no requirement for us to be physically intimate or share marital intimacy for the rest of our marriage. I felt a bit sad and unsure about this, but I eventually agreed because I believed that with time I could regain his respect, trust, and passionate love. However, things haven't turned out the way I expected, and that's why I'm sharing this. We are now 17.5 months into what I call our second marriage, but our relationship feels more like we're housemates raising our kids. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful every day for the second chance I've been given, but what we have doesn't really resemble a traditional marriage. It's more like two divorced individuals living together. Since my affair, Jim hasn't shown any affection towards me, not even a simple kiss or hug. He won't let me get close to him for any kind of affection, although I occasionally manage to sneak in a hug and kiss before he can block me. I can tell he doesn't like it, so I don't do it very often. Additionally, he insists that I undergo monthly at-home STD testing. Furthermore, since the affair, Jim refuses to go out in public with me, even to family gatherings. When our boys have games, we take turns attending. When it's my turn, Jim comes to the games but doesn't sit with me. Instead, he usually stands on the sidelines with other fathers and acts as if I'm not there. The only time we go out together is when we leave town or go on vacations, which we do quite frequently. Jim refuses to move from the neighborhood unless he receives a job promotion that requires him to relocate. If that doesn't happen, his plan is to stay in our current home until our boys finish high school. The boys also prefer not to move because all their friends live within a short distance from our house, and the same goes for Jim and his friends. Since the affair, I've lost all the friendships I had in our neighborhood. Steve and Marcia divorced 8 months after D-Day, Discovery Day, but Marcia and her kids still reside in the same house down the street. The women in the neighborhood I used to be close to have essentially cut ties with me and hold me responsible for breaking up their family. Consequently, my home has become somewhat like a prison when I'm here. I rarely go out front and mostly stay inside or in my backyard tending to my gardens. My boys are frequently out and about in the neighborhood, or they have their friends over at our house, including Marcia and Steve's kids. Fortunately, not much has changed in their world. Jim follows a similar routine. He's good friends with the neighborhood men. They either come over to our house, where they enjoy cigars and bourbon on our back porch at night, or he's at one of their homes. Jim's daily routine typically involves going to work, hitting the gym, and then returning home. He prepares his own meals and rarely eats dinner with us. He refuses to eat anything I cook, although he did sneak a few cookies I made the other day. On weekends, he grills his own food and only eats what he cooks, avoiding my dishes. The weekday dinners I share with my boys have been a wonderful bonding experience for us. They prefer to eat shortly after coming home from school, so the three of us usually have dinner around 4 p.m. I have everything prepared, and they help set the table, assist with final food preparations, and pitch in with cleaning up after the meal. I truly value this time because it has brought us closer and taught them important life skills. They also help in the garden where we have cultivated a delightful space in our backyard with beautiful landscaping. To summarize, some aspects of my life are quite positive, while others are significantly challenging. I guess this is a roundabout way of asking whether you think I should continue this marriage as it is or if I should let Jim go now and give him the financial benefits as if he had stayed with me. Deep down, I know he's not happy. How could he be? It's clear that he no longer sees me as his wife or lover but rather as a co-parent, which we both excel at, by the way. I love Jim deeply and will carry the burden of what I did to him for the rest of my life. I want nothing more than to return to the loving relationship we once had, but I'm not sure he's willing to go there with us. Please share your thoughts on what I should do. I would greatly appreciate any suggestions on how I can successfully regain my husband's love and trust after such a blatant betrayal. First update, 7 weeks later, I've come back to provide an update on my situation. Last month, following the advice of many of you, I decided to move out of our house temporarily to give our marriage some space. I found a short-term rental for a nicely furnished apartment nearby, and I've been living there ever since. While I do miss being in the same house as my husband and boys, along with my gardens, it has been somewhat of a relief to get away from that neighborhood. There are so many painful memories and negative vibes there, all of which I know are my fault. I'm not making excuses for what I've caused. When I told Jim of my decision, he seemed surprised and somewhat saddened, asking numerous questions. His reaction conveyed a lot to me. It indicated that he still has feelings for me, and I could see it in his eyes. I pick up my boys after school, and they come to my place for dinner and spend the night a few days a week. Jim and I are flexible about this, and the kids know they can come and go as they please at either place. The main issue I'm facing now is that since I'm no longer at home, I don't get to see Jim very often. I'm also not in a position where I can talk to him in person, so I end up calling him with trivial questions multiple times a week just to stay in touch. We've had several lengthy conversations about various topics recently, which is another sign that he still cares for me. I know I still love him. That's all for now, thank you and take care. Final update, 5 months from the last update. I've held off on coming back to provide an update because I wanted to allow enough time to offer a comprehensive perspective on my situation. What a journey it has been. It's been a real roller coaster ride. Life certainly has its share of highs and lows. First, the downside. After 2 years into our second marriage, Jim decided that it would be best for us to get a divorce. Jim mentioned that while he still cares about me and may consider rekindling a romantic relationship in the future, he believes he can't do so while we're still legally married. I don't fully grasp what he means, but he explained that it's something psychological.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, and click on the little bell icon for notifications of new stories.